Let's get started. Story number 1.
It was New Year's Eve 2023, and the group of friends had gathered in a sleek high-rise apartment in downtown Chicago. The unit on the 34th floor was a minimalist's dream. All glass walls, polished floors, and a sprawling view of the city skyline. The host, Maya, had rented the place on a whim after stumbling upon it on a short-term rental app. It was described as ultra-modern with a rich history, which Maya thought was a strange selling point for such a modern-looking building, but she didn't dwell on it. By 11:30 p.m., the party was in full swing. A mix of thumping music, champagne glasses clinking, and laughter filled the air. Maya, stylish in her sequin dress, had just finished topping off her drink when her phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number. "I see you." She frowned and showed it to her best friend, Leah. "Probably a prank," Leah said with a shrug, taking a sip of her drink. "Maybe," Maya said, though her unease lingered. She blocked the number and pushed the thought away. At midnight, everyone crowded near the glass walls to watch the fireworks erupt over Lake Michigan. The apartment's panoramic view was breathtaking, and as the colorful explosions lit up the sky, Maya felt her earlier tension dissolve. But then it started, a faint knocking sound. At first, Maya thought it was coming from one of the neighbors, though she wondered who would bother knocking on New Year's Eve instead of texting or calling. She ignored it, focusing on the cheers and fireworks. But the knocking continued, rhythmic and deliberate. She turned to Leah. "Do you hear that?" Leah nodded, her expression shifting from amused to concerned. "It's coming from the hallway." The two of them slipped away from the party, stepping into the dimly lit corridor. The sound grew louder, and they traced it to the apartment door. Maya hesitated before unlocking it and pulling it open. The hallway was empty. Cold air brushed past them, and Maya instinctively hugged her arms. She glanced around, but saw nothing unusual. "It's freezing out here," Leah muttered. "Maybe it's just some drunk people messing around." Maya nodded and closed the door. But as she locked it, her phone buzzed again. "Why didn't you answer?" Her stomach twisted as she stared at the screen. The message was from the same number she had just blocked. "How is that possible?" she whispered. "What?" Leah asked, peering over her shoulder. When she saw the message, her face paled. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Maya agreed. She deleted the message and turned her phone off, determined not to let it ruin the night. But her unease only grew when she rejoined the party. The music seemed softer, the laughter more strained. She glanced around the room and noticed the guests had thinned out. Some people were missing, but she couldn't figure out who. "Where's Jason?" she asked Leah. Leah frowned. "He was just here. Maybe he stepped out for air." But Maya had a sinking feeling that wasn't the case. She checked the balcony, the bathroom, and even the bedroom. Jason wasn't anywhere. As she returned to the living room, her eyes caught something strange. One of the glass walls near the balcony had fogged up slightly, despite the apartment's excellent climate control. And there, in the center of the fog, was a handprint. Maya's heart raced. "Did someone touch the glass?" "No one's been over there," Leah said, looking just as confused. Maya grabbed a towel and wiped the glass clean, trying to shake the unsettling feeling creeping over her. It didn't work. Minutes later, her phone buzzed again. Against her better judgment, she turned it on. "I'm still here." "Okay, this is getting ridiculous," Maya said, her voice shaking. She showed Leah the message. "Maybe it's someone at the party?" Leah suggested. But the partygoers had dwindled to just a handful, and none of them seemed like they were in on a joke. Then the lights flickered. Everyone froze, their laughter replaced by nervous silence. "Old building," someone muttered, though Maya knew that wasn't true. The building was practically new, that had completed just 3 years ago. The flickering stopped, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. The once warm glow of the party felt cold, almost sterile. Maya felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. "Let's call it a night," she said, forcing a smile. The remaining guests didn't argue, grabbing their coats and filing out quickly. Within minutes, only Maya, Leah, and Mark, their mutual friend, were left. "We'll clean up in the morning," Leah said. "Let's just get some sleep." Maya nodded, though she doubted she'd get a wink of rest. The three of them settled in the living room, too uneasy to sleep in separate rooms. Mark sprawled on the couch while Maya and Leah curled up on the floor with blankets. At 3 a.m., Maya woke to the sound of footsteps. Her eyes snapped open, and she saw a shadow moving across the far wall. At first, she thought it was Mark, but a quick glance confirmed he was still asleep. "Leah," she whispered, shaking her friend awake. "What?" Leah mumbled groggily. Maya pointed toward the shadow, which now seemed to stretch unnaturally long, its edges flickering as though it were alive. Leah gasped, sitting up. "What is that?" "I don't know," Maya whispered. The shadow moved closer, and for the first time, Maya noticed the temperature had dropped sharply. She could see her breath in the air. "Mark," Leah hissed, shaking him awake. Mark groaned, but sat up quickly when he saw the shadow. "What the hell is that?" The shadow stopped abruptly, and for a moment the room was deathly silent. Then a voice, low and guttural, echoed through the apartment. "Get out." Maya didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her coat and bolted for the door, Leah and Mark close behind. As they reached the hallway, the lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The three of them raced to the elevator, but when they pressed the button, nothing happened. "Stairs," Mark said, already running. The stairwell was even colder than the apartment, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. Every step echoed loudly, making it feel like something or someone was chasing them. By the time they reached the lobby, they were breathless and trembling. The security guard at the front desk gave them a strange look. "Everything okay?" he asked. "No," Maya said, her voice shaking. "There's something in our apartment." The guard frowned. "That's not possible. No one else has access to your unit." Maya didn't argue. She just wanted to get out of the building. They spent the rest of the night at a nearby diner, nursing cups of coffee and trying to make sense of what had happened. The next morning, Maya got a call from the property manager. "Miss Patel, I need to ask, did you or your guests leave the balcony door open?" "No," Maya said, confused. "Why?" "There's snow inside the living room," the manager said, "and footprints leading to the window." Maya's blood ran cold. "What kind of footprints?" The manager hesitated. "They're strange. Too large to be human, but definitely not animal. Honestly, I've never seen anything like it." Maya hung up without another word. She never went back to the apartment. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
The music thumped, shaking the old, creaky house with every bass drop. Emma leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping her champagne and smiling as her friends crowded the living room. It was New Year's Eve, and the historic mansion they'd rented for the party had more than lived up to its reputation as an atmospheric getaway. The house, built in the late 1800s, had a charmingly eerie quality to it. A grand staircase with weathered banisters, cobwebbed chandeliers, and stained glass windows that distorted the moonlight in unsettling ways. The group had laughed when the owner mentioned it was supposedly haunted. "It's perfect for a New Year's party," Emma had said, never one to shy away from spooky legends. By 1 a.m., most of the guests had either paired off to quiet corners or started to leave. Emma noticed the energy in the house shifting. The once boisterous laughter had dwindled to quiet murmurs, and an odd chill crept through the rooms. She assumed it was the drafty old house. "Hey, Emma," called Jake, her best friend. He was leaning against the living room doorway, his face pale and serious. "Can you come here for a sec?" Emma followed him, weaving through the discarded plastic cups and party favors. Jake led her toward the back of the house, where a small den lay shrouded in shadows. "I thought this part of the house was off limits," she said, eyeing the heavy velvet curtain that separated the den from the rest of the mansion. "It is," Jake replied, his voice low, "but I heard something weird coming from here earlier, like whispering." Emma chuckled nervously. "Maybe it's someone sneaking in to make out or something." Jake didn't laugh. Instead, he pushed aside the curtain and motioned for Emma to follow him inside. The den was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the moon through a cracked window. A fireplace dominated the far wall, its ornate mantelpiece carved with strange, twisting shapes that resembled faces. Emma froze. In front of the fireplace stood a figure. At first, she thought it was one of their friends playing a prank, someone trying to amp up the creep factor of the old house. But the figure didn't move. It was tall, with its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Its outline seemed blurry, as if it were flickering in and out of existence. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice trembling. The figure turned slowly. Emma gasped, her heart hammering in her chest. Its face was indistinct, like a smear of shadow, but its eyes, two pinpricks of glowing red, burned into her. Jake grabbed her arm and yanked her back toward the curtain. They stumbled into the hallway, breathless and wide-eyed. "What the hell was that?" Emma whispered. "I don't know," Jake replied, his voice shaking. "But we need to tell the others." They hurried back to the living room, but the atmosphere had shifted again. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The remaining guests stood in small groups, their conversations hushed. One of them, a girl named Becca, clutched her phone tightly, her face pale. "Did you see it?" Becca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" Jake asked, though Emma suspected she already knew the answer. "The woman," Becca said. "She was just standing in the hallway, staring at me. But when I looked again, she was gone." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "We saw something too," she said. "In the den." Becca's eyes widened. "The den? That's where she's supposed to be." "Wait, what?" Jake asked. Becca hesitated, glancing at the others. "I googled the house earlier. It's famous for this ghost, a woman who died here on New Year's Eve back in the 1920s. She caught her husband with another woman and, well, she didn't take it well. People say she haunts the house, especially on New Year's." "That's ridiculous," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Becca asked. "Because I swear I saw her." As if on cue, the lights flickered. The room plunged into darkness for a moment before the dim glow of a few battery-powered fairy lights returned. Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to find a text from an unknown number. The message read, "Get out." Shh. Her breath caught in her throat. She showed it to Jake, who looked equally unsettled. "Who sent that?" he asked. "I don't know," Emma whispered. A loud crash echoed through the house, making everyone jump. It came from the direction of the den. "Nope, nope, I'm out," one of the guests muttered, grabbing their coat and heading for the door. The others hesitated, torn between curiosity and fear. Emma, however, felt compelled to investigate. "Emma, don't!" Jake warned as she started toward the den. "I just want to see," she said, though her voice wavered. The den was empty when she stepped inside, but the air was colder, and the fireplace seemed darker, as if it absorbed the light around it. She was about to leave when she noticed something on the mantelpiece, an old photograph in a tarnished silver frame. The image showed a woman in a flapper dress, her dark eyes staring directly into the camera. She was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about her expression, something bitter and angry. The floorboards creaked behind Emma. She turned quickly, expecting Jake or one of the others, but the doorway was empty. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. A soft whisper brushed against her ear. "Leave." Emma bolted from the den, her heart racing. She collided with Jake in the hallway. "We need to get everyone out of here," she said. Jake nodded. Together, they ushered the remaining guests toward the front door. But as they reached the foyer, the door slammed shut on its own. No matter how hard they pulled, it wouldn't budge. The whispers began again, louder this time, filling the air with a chorus of unintelligible voices. Emma covered her ears, panic rising in her chest. Suddenly, the chandelier above them began to sway. The ancient crystal fixture groaned under its own weight before crashing to the floor, narrowly missing them. "Basement," Becca yelled. "There's a door to the cellar. It might lead outside." They scrambled down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the narrow staircase. The basement was damp and smelled of mildew, but there was a small door in the corner that looked like it led outside. Jake tugged on the handle, but it, too, was stuck. "Move," Emma said, grabbing a nearby crowbar. She wedged it into the doorframe and pushed with all her strength. The door finally gave way, revealing the cold night outside. One by one, they stumbled out into the fresh air. When Emma looked back at the house, she saw the woman again, standing in the window of the den. Her red eyes glowed faintly, and a malicious smile curved her lips. The group didn't stop running until they were far from the house. They huddled together in the middle of the street, shivering in the winter air. "What the hell just happened?" Jake asked. Emma didn't answer. She couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only narrowly escaped something much worse. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, she made a silent vow. Never again would she mock the stories of haunted houses. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snow fell in thick, soundless sheets outside the cabin as the four friends laughed and clinked glasses. It was supposed to be a low-key New Year's Eve. Just them, a roaring fire, and enough drinks to last until midnight. The cabin sat deep in the woods, miles away from any town, isolated in a way that felt both liberating and slightly unnerving. Emily leaned back on the couch, her cheeks flushed from the wine. "All right," she said. "Since it's New Year's Eve, we have to tell a scary story." "Really?" Mark groaned, rolling his eyes. He was sprawled out on the rug near the fire, his hand wrapped around a half-empty beer. "Yes, really," Emily said. "It's tradition." "We're in a creepy cabin in the middle of nowhere," Lisa chimed in from her spot by the window. "It feels appropriate." "I've got one," Chris said, his voice low and serious. He was sitting at the kitchen table, sharpening a pocket knife for no apparent reason. "But it's about this area." Emily's eyes lit up. "Go on." Chris leaned forward, the blade catching the firelight. "This forest has a legend. They call it the Watcher. People say if you're out here late at night, you'll feel it before you see it, this heavy, crawling sensation like someone's standing right behind you. But when you turn around, there's no one there." "Until there is," Lisa said with a nervous laugh, glancing at the window. "Exactly," Chris said. "They say the Watcher doesn't just want to scare you, it wants something else, something you can't take back." Mark snorted. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." Chris shrugged. "Believe what you want, but keep an eye on the woods tonight. You never know who or what might be watching." The group laughed it off and moved on to other topics, but Emily couldn't shake the eerie feeling Chris's story left behind. She found herself glancing at the windows more often, like half expecting to see a figure standing in the snow. By the time midnight rolled around, the party had dwindled. Mark had passed out on the couch, Lisa was cleaning up the kitchen, and Chris was nowhere to be seen. "I'm going to get some air," Emily said, grabbing her coat. "Are you crazy?" Lisa asked. "It's freezing out there." "I won't be long," Emily replied, already pulling on her boots. She stepped outside and was immediately enveloped by the cold, the kind that numbed her fingers and bit at her face. The snow had stopped, leaving the forest eerily quiet. Emily walked a few steps away from the cabin, her breath visible in the icy air. The trees loomed around her, their bare branches clawing at the sky. She looked up, marveling at how bright the stars were out here, far from the city lights. A soft crunch behind her made her freeze. "Chris?" she called out, turning around. No one was there. She told herself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but her heart raced as she hurried back toward the cabin. As she reached the door, she paused. There, in the freshly fallen snow, were footprints. They weren't hers, and they weren't Chris's. They were much larger, almost human, but wrong. The toes were elongated, and the impressions were deeper than they should have been, as if whoever or whatever had made them was far heavier than a person. Emily burst into the cabin, slamming the door behind her. "What's wrong?" Lisa asked, looking up from the sink. "There's something out there," Emily whispered. Lisa frowned. "What do you mean?" Before Emily could answer, a loud thud echoed from the roof. Mark sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes. "What the hell was that?" Another thud, louder this time, made the cabin shake. "Chris?" Lisa called out, her voice trembling. "No way that's Chris," Mark said, his face pale. The group huddled together, staring at the ceiling. The thudding continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the roof to the other. Emily grabbed the fire poker, her knuckles white. "We need to find Chris." Mark shook his head. "Are you insane? We need to stay here and wait it out." But Emily was already heading for the door. "Emily, don't," Lisa pleaded. "I can't just leave him out there," Emily shouted. The door creaked open, and the cold rushed in. Emily stepped outside, clutching the fire poker tightly. The footprints were still there, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. "Chris?" she called out, her voice shaking. The forest was silent except for the soft crunch of her boots in the snow. She followed the footprints, each step taking her deeper into the woods. "Chris!" she yelled again. A faint sound reached her ears, a low, guttural growl that made her blood run cold. She stopped, her breath coming in short gasps. The trees around her seemed to close in, their shadows twisting and writhing. "Emily." She spun around. The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it sounded like Chris. "Chris, where are you?" "Emily." The voice came again, closer this time. She turned in circles, trying to locate the source, but the forest looked the same in every direction. And then she saw it. At first, she thought it was Chris, but as it stepped into the moonlight, she realized how wrong she was. It was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that were too long and bent at unnatural angles. Its face was pale and featureless, except for two deep, hollow eyes that seemed to suck in the light around them. "Emily," it said again in Chris's voice, but the sound was distorted, as if coming from a broken speaker. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding. The creature tilted its head, watching her with unsettling intensity. She turned and ran, the fire poker slipping from her grasp. The thing didn't chase her. Instead, its laughter echoed through the woods, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. When she burst back into the cabin, the others stared at her, wide-eyed. "Where's Chris?" Lisa asked. He's gone," Emily stammered. The thudding on the roof started again, louder this time. The group huddled together as the sound moved to the windows. The glass panes frosted over, obscuring their view. "Is it still out there?" Mark whispered. Before anyone could answer, the front door creaked open. "Chris?" Lisa called out, her voice trembling. A figure stepped inside, covered in snow. It was Chris, or at least it looked like him. "Close the door," he said, his voice flat. Emily stared at him, her gut telling her something was wrong. Chris's movements were stiff, mechanical, and his eyes, normally bright and mischievous, were dull and lifeless. "Are you okay?" Lisa asked, stepping toward him. "I'm fine," Chris replied. Emily grabbed Lisa's arm, battered. "Don't go near him." "What's wrong with you?" Lisa snapped. "That's not Chris," Emily said, her voice shaking. Chris tilted his head, a slow, unnatural movement. "Emily, you're scaring everyone." "Stay back," Emily said, her voice rising. Chris smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was too wide, too toothy, stretching his face inhumanly. The lights flickered, and when they came back on, Chris was gone. The group spent the rest of the night huddled together, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, they ventured outside. There was no sign of Chris, but the footprints in the snow led away from the cabin, disappearing into the forest. Emily looked back at the cabin one last time before they left, and for a brief moment she thought she saw a figure standing in the window, watching them. She didn't tell the others. Some things are better left unsaid. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was New Year's Eve 2023, and the blizzard that swept across Pennsylvania had turned the streets into a ghostly white wasteland. For Alex, Carmen, Jake, and Mia, the storm wasn't enough to cancel their plans. They had been invited to a late-night New Year's party at an old manor house on the outskirts of town, owned by one of Alex's college friends, Sarah. The house was a relic of the 1800s, its dark wooden facade partially obscured by heavy snow. When they pulled up to the long driveway, the only light came from the windows and the dim flicker of an ancient lantern hanging by the front door. "Are we sure this is the place?" Carmen asked, clutching her coat tighter as the car heater struggled against the cold. "This is it," Alex said, peering out at the house. Sarah said it used to be some kind of boarding school before her parents bought it. "It looks haunted," Jake muttered, earning a laugh from Mia. "Relax," Mia said. "It's just an old house. Let's go. I need a drink." Inside, the party was in full swing. A mix of people filled the large, dimly lit rooms, the chatter blending with the faint crackle of a fireplace and the occasional hum of wind rattling the windows. Sarah greeted them warmly, her eyes bright with excitement. "Welcome to the old Winchester place," she said with a grin. "Don't worry, it's not really haunted. Probably." "Probably?" Carmen asked, raising an eyebrow. Sarah waved it off. "Just there are stories, sure, but it's all just town folklore. Enjoy yourselves." As the night wore on, the group began to settle in. Drinks flowed, music played, and the storm outside seemed to fade into the background. But Alex couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had crept over him the moment they entered the house. He found himself wandering away from the main party, drawn to a long hallway lined with faded portraits. The faces in the paintings seemed to watch him as he passed, their eyes dark and piercing. Creepy, right? Sarah's voice startled him, and he turned to see her leaning against the wall with a glass of wine in hand. "What's with these?" Alex asked, gesturing to the portraits. "They're from when this was a boarding school," Sarah said. "The kids who used to live here. Most of them are probably long gone by now." "Probably?" Alex asked, echoing Carmen's earlier skepticism. Sarah shrugged. "There's a story about a kid who disappeared here in the early 1900s. James something. They say he used to wander the halls at night, talking to shadows. One day, he vanished. No body, no nothing. People claimed he was taken by something in the house. Something? Sarah grinned. It's just a story. Don't let it freak you out. But it did freak Alex out. Later, as midnight approached, the group gathered in one of the grand old sitting rooms, where a large clock chimed faintly in the background. The storm outside had intensified, and the windows were now nearly opaque with frost. "This house gives me the creeps," Carmen said, glancing around. "Come on," Mia said. "It's just an old place. Nothing to be scared of." As if on cue, the lights flickered. The group fell silent, the festive mood suddenly replaced by an undercurrent of unease. "Great," Jake said. "The storm's messing with the power." Sarah entered the room, carrying a tray of champagne glasses. "Don't worry, we've got backup generators. Worst case, we'll just light some candles. It's not the first time this has happened." They tried to shake off the tension, but as the countdown to midnight began, Alex's unease deepened. 10. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment before they came back on. A 9. A faint sound like a child laughing echoed from somewhere in the house. 8. Carmen froze. Did anyone else hear that? 7. Jake shook his head. Probably just the wind. 6. The laughter came again, louder this time, followed by the soft patter of footsteps on the floor above them. 5. Sarah's face paled. No one else is here. 4. The sound of footsteps grew louder, as if someone or something was running back and forth across the upper floor. 3. The chandelier above them swayed, the crystals clinking softly as the wind outside howled. 2. The laughter stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on the room. 1. The clock struck midnight, its chime reverberating through the house. And then, everything went dark. Mia screamed as the lights flickered back on, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. It was a boy, no older than 10, dressed in tattered clothing. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were empty black voids. "Who?" Alex began, but the boy turned and ran, disappearing into the hallway. "Did you see that?" Carmen whispered, her voice shaking. "What the hell was that?" Jake said, standing and grabbing a fireplace poker. Sarah looked terrified. "That's impossible. No one else is supposed to be here." The group followed Alex into the hallway, their steps hesitant. The house seemed to have grown colder, the air thick with a sense of dread. They found the boy at the end of the hallway, standing in front of a door. He turned to face them, like his mouth moving silently, as if speaking words they couldn't hear. "Is that James?" Sarah whispered, her face ashen. The boy raised a hand, pointing at the door. Then, without warning, he vanished. "What is happening?" Mia cried, clinging to Carmen. Alex approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. "Don't," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. But it was too late. Alex opened the door to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A cold draft wafted up, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. "We shouldn't go down there," Carmen said, her voice shaking. "We have to," Alex said. "Whatever this is, it's not going to stop until we figure it out." Reluctantly, the group descended the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness seemed to press in around them. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a small, unfinished basement. The walls were lined with rotting wooden shelves, and in the center of the room was an old trunk, its surface covered in dust and scratches. The group hesitated, staring at the trunk. "Do we open it?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to," Alex said. He knelt and unlatched the trunk, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. As he lifted the lid, the room seemed to grow colder still. Inside was a collection of old weathered toys, a wooden train, a stuffed bear missing an eye, and a small leather-bound journal. Alex picked up the journal and opened it, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The handwriting was shaky, written in a child's scrawl. "They come at night. They want me to play with them, but I don't want to go. I'm scared." The final entry sent a chill down Alex's spine. "They said I can't leave. I belong to the house now." As Alex read the words aloud, the basement door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. The group screamed, fumbling for their phones to use as flashlights. And then they heard it, the sound of children laughing coming from all around them. The laughter grew louder, joined by the patter of footsteps and the faint sound of whispers. Shadows danced along the walls, moving faster and faster. "We need to get out of here," Mia screamed. But as they turned toward the stairs, the shadows coalesced into a single towering figure. Its form was indistinct, shifting and flickering like smoke, but its presence was overwhelming. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant. The group froze, paralyzed by fear. "You belong to us now," it said. "No," Alex shouted, clutching the journal. "We're leaving!" He hurled the journal at the figure, and for a brief moment, it seemed to waver. "Run!" Sarah screamed. They bolted up the stairs, the laughter and whispers chasing them. When they reached the hallway, they didn't stop, sprinting for the front door and bursting out into the freezing night. The house loomed behind them, its windows dark and unwelcoming. They didn't speak as they piled into the car, driving away as fast as the icy roads would allow. It wasn't until they were miles away that Sarah broke the silence. "I'm never going back there," she said, her voice trembling. None of them argued. Years later, Alex searched online for records of the house. He found an old newspaper article from 1907. "Local boy disappears in boarding school tragedy." The article mentioned James, the boy who vanished without a trace. But what caught Alex's attention was the final line. "The Winchester house has since gained a reputation as cursed, with many claiming it is home to restless spirits who prey on the living." Alex closed his laptop and vowed never to speak of that night again.
Story number 5.
It was New Year's Eve, 2023. Olivia and her husband Daniel had been invited to a late-night New Year's party at a renovated inn just outside of Boston. The place, known as the Ashwood Inn, had been a local landmark for over a century. Recently restored by a tech entrepreneur named Patrick, it had quickly gained attention for its stunning combination of vintage charm and modern luxury. Patrick, an acquaintance of Daniel's from work, had extended the invitation personally. "You'll love it," he'd said. "The inn's got history, atmosphere, and the best view of the fireworks in town." The couple arrived just after 10 p.m., the last snowstorm of the year dusting the old inn in a frosty shimmer. The Ashwood was breathtaking, its Victorian architecture looming against the night sky. But as Olivia stepped inside, she felt a subtle chill that wasn't from the cold. The party was in full swing, with about 20 guests scattered across the large sitting room and dining area. A roaring fire crackled in the hearth, and champagne flowed freely. Olivia forced a smile as Patrick greeted them warmly, but she couldn't shake the faint unease that prickled at the back of her neck. "I'm telling you, this place used to be a boarding house for sailors," Patrick said, leading them to the bar. "Rumor has it, a few of them never left." Daniel laughed. "Are we talking ghosts?" "Something like that," Patrick said with a wink. "Old houses like this always come with stories." As midnight approached, Patrick insisted they take a tour of the inn. "You've got to see the upstairs," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "The restoration work is incredible." A small group of guests, including Olivia and Daniel, followed him up the grand staircase. The second floor was quieter, the polished wooden floors creaking softly underfoot. Patrick pointed out various details, the original crown molding, the antique mirrors, the ornate banisters, but Olivia's attention kept drifting. She felt as though they were being watched. When they reached the end of the hallway, Patrick paused outside a door. "This room's got the most history," he said. "It used to belong to the innkeeper's daughter back in the 1920s. She supposedly died here under mysterious circumstances." Someone in the group chuckled nervously. Patrick grinned and pushed the door open. The room was small but cozy, with floral wallpaper and an old-fashioned canopy bed. A single oil lamp cast a warm glow over the space. Legend has it, if you stand in front of the mirror and say her name 3 times, you can see her reflection, Patrick said, gesturing to an ornate oval mirror hanging on the wall. "Cliché," Daniel muttered, earning a few laughs. Olivia, however, felt a wave of discomfort as her eyes lingered on the mirror. The glass seemed off, slightly warped as though it were holding onto a secret. She stayed near the door as the others took turns jokingly testing the legend. Nothing happened, of course, but Olivia felt relieved when Patrick finally led them back downstairs. Midnight came, and the guests gathered in the sitting room to watch the fireworks from the large bay windows. Glasses clinked, and everyone cheered as the new year was welcomed with bright bursts of light. For a brief moment, Olivia's unease lifted. But as the party began to wind down and people started to leave, Patrick approached Olivia and Daniel with a mischievous grin. "Feel like spending the night?" he asked. "We've got plenty of rooms. You won't have to drive home in the snow." Daniel was quick to agree. "Why not? Beats dealing with icy roads." Olivia hesitated but didn't want to seem paranoid. "Sure," she said, forcing a smile. Patrick handed them a key to one of the guest rooms on the second floor. "Make yourselves at home." The room was quaint, with a plush queen-sized bed and a vintage armchair by the window. Daniel was asleep within minutes, but Olivia lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than before. At some point she drifted off, only to wake suddenly to the sound of faint footsteps. She sat up, her heart pounding, and glanced at Daniel, who was still sound asleep. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside their door. "Hello?" she called softly. No response. She slid out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the air was colder than before. As she stepped out, she heard it again. Footsteps. But this time they were coming from the far end of the hallway. Curiosity overtook her fear, and she followed the sound. The hallway seemed longer than before, the shadows darker. She found herself standing in front of the same room Patrick had shown them earlier, the one with the mirror. The door creaked open on its own. "Daniel?" she whispered, as though hoping he'd somehow followed her. The room was empty, but the mirror caught her attention immediately. The glass was no longer warped. It was impossibly clear, like a pool of dark water. And then she saw it. Movement. It wasn't her reflection. A young woman with dark hair and hollow eyes stared back at her, her pale hand pressed against the glass. Olivia froze as the figure's lips moved silently, forming words she couldn't hear. "Olivia." The whisper was faint but unmistakable, and it wasn't coming from the mirror. It was right behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. The door slammed shut, and the air grew heavy. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." Olivia's legs refused to move as the figure in the mirror began to shift, her expression contorting into something anguished. Cracks spidered across the glass, and the room seemed to close in on itself. "Let me out," the voice demanded, echoing around her. Finally, Olivia found her strength. She bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting down the hallway. The house felt alive, the walls groaning and the lights flickering wildly. She burst into her room and shook Daniel awake. "We have to go. Now." Daniel, groggy and confused, didn't argue as she grabbed their belongings and dragged him downstairs. Patrick was nowhere to be found, and the front door seemed impossibly far away. As they reached it, Olivia glanced back and saw her. The woman from the mirror stood at the top of the staircase, her hollow eyes watching them. Then she was gone. They didn't stop running until they were in their car, the engine sputtering to life in the freezing cold. As they drove away, Olivia refused to look back at the house, afraid of what she might see. The next day, she received a message from Patrick. "Hope you two enjoyed the stay. Let me know if you want to come back." Olivia deleted the message without responding. She didn't tell him what she saw, but she knew one thing for sure. Something in the Ashwood Inn wasn't ready to let go of the past.
Story number 6.
It was New Year's Eve, 2023. The air was crisp, the streets quiet except for the occasional rumble of fireworks in the distance. Michelle, her boyfriend Ryan, and their close-knit group of friends, Claire, Jason, and Emily, were heading to a late-night New Year's party at an old house in rural Maryland. The house belonged to Emily's cousin, Nate, who had inherited it from a distant relative. It was a sprawling, Victorian-style mansion that had stood abandoned for years before Nate decided to fix it up. When Nate invited Emily and her friends for a small, intimate gathering to ring the new year, they jumped at the chance. The house was nestled deep in the woods, and by the time they arrived, the snow-covered driveway and towering trees gave it an eerie, isolated feel. The dim glow of lights in the windows was the only indication anyone was there. "Are you sure this is it?" Michelle asked, peering out at the imposing structure. "This is it," Emily said. "Don't let the outside fool you. Nate's been working on it for months." As they stepped inside, they were greeted by Nate and a handful of other guests. The interior was a strange mix of old-world charm and modern renovation. The furniture was sleek and new, but the creaking floorboards and faded wallpaper reminded everyone of the house's age. "Make yourselves comfortable," Nate said, handing each of them a glass of champagne. "But if you wander around, stick to the main areas. Some parts of the house aren't exactly stable." "What do you mean by stable?" Jason asked with a laugh, but Nate didn't elaborate. The party was low-key but enjoyable. Music played softly from a Bluetooth speaker, and everyone mingled over drinks and snacks. But as the hours passed, Michelle couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. The house felt too quiet. Even with the faint hum of conversation and music, it was as if the walls were listening. At one point, Michelle found herself standing near a large bay window, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. That's when she saw it. A figure moving in the trees. It was faint, barely more than a shadow, but it was unmistakable. "Ryan," she whispered, grabbing his arm. "Look." Ryan followed her gaze but shook his head. "I don't see anything. It's probably just the wind moving the branches." But Michelle wasn't convinced. As midnight approached, Nate gathered everyone in the sitting room for the countdown. A massive antique grandfather clock dominated one corner of the room, its pendulum swinging rhythmically. 10 seconds, Nate called out, and everyone joined in the countdown. 10, 9, 8. Michelle glanced around the room, her unease growing. 7, 6, 5. The fire in the hearth crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. 4, 3, 2. The clock chimed midnight, its deep, resonant tone echoing through the house. And then the lights flickered and went out. The room fell into complete darkness, and someone let out a nervous laugh. "Great timing," Jason said. "Hold on," Nate said. "Let me check the breaker." As Nate stepped away, Michelle felt the temperature drop. The room grew icy, and a heavy silence settled over them. "Is it just me, or is it freezing in here?" Claire whispered. Before anyone could answer, a faint sound broke the silence, a low, melodic humming. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, filling the room. "Is that singing?" Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The humming seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the fire in the hearth. "Okay, what the hell is going on?" Jason said, standing up. That's when Michelle saw it. In the dim light of the moon filtering through the windows, a figure stood by the grandfather clock. It was a woman, her features obscured by the shadows, but her presence was undeniable. "Who's there?" Michelle demanded, her voice trembling. The woman didn't move, but the humming stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, in a voice that was both distant and chillingly close, the figure whispered, "Get out." Panic set in. Claire screamed, and Jason fumbled for his phone to turn on the flashlight. But when the beam of light illuminated the corner where the figure had been, there was no one there. "We're leaving," Michelle said, grabbing Ryan's arm. The group hurried toward the front door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard they pulled or pushed, it remained firmly shut. "Why won't it open?" Claire cried, her voice shaking. "Windows," Ryan said. "We'll climb out." But when they tried to open the windows, they found them frozen shut, the glass thick with frost despite the warmth of the house. "I told you," Nate said, his voice breaking. "This house has a history." "What are you talking about?" Emily demanded. Nate hesitated, his face pale. "It's haunted. My great-aunt lived here alone for years. She said the house was cursed, that it wouldn't let people leave." "You're just now telling us this?" Jason shouted. Before Nate could answer, the humming returned, louder and more insistent. This time, it was accompanied by footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the sitting room. "Upstairs," Michelle said. "We'll hide." The group bolted up the staircase, their footsteps echoing through the house. They found a bedroom and locked the door behind them. The humming continued, growing fainter but never entirely fading. "What do we do now?" Claire whispered. Michelle's mind raced. She remembered something her grandmother had told her years ago about spirits. Sometimes they were bound to an object. "The clock," she said. "It started when the clock chimed midnight." "What are you saying?" Ryan asked. "We have to stop it. Destroy it, maybe." "That's insane," Jason said. "Do you have a better idea?" Michelle shot back. Reluctantly, the group agreed. Armed with a fireplace poker they found in the room, they made their way back downstairs. The humming grew louder as they approached the sitting room, and the temperature dropped even further. When they reached the clock, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The hands of the clock were spinning wildly, the pendulum moving faster than physics should allow. "Do it," Michelle said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her chest. Ryan swung the poker, smashing it into the clock. The glass shattered, and the humming stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a piercing scream filled the house, and the figure of the woman appeared again, her face contorted in rage. She reached out toward them, but as the clock collapsed under the force of Ryan's swings, she began to fade. Within seconds, she was gone, and the house fell silent. The group didn't wait to see if she would return. They grabbed their coats and bolted for the door, which now opened with ease. They didn't stop running until they were in their car, the engine roaring to life as they sped away from the house. None of them spoke during the drive back to the city. The memories of what they had seen and the feeling of the woman's eyes on them would haunt them for years to come.
Story number 7.
The invitation came from a friend of a friend. Claire didn't know him well, just a guy named Mark who she'd met once at a work event, but when he invited her and her boyfriend Ian to a New Year's Eve party at his family's estate, she couldn't say no. Mark had talked it up as a once-in-a-lifetime kind of event. "It's the perfect spot for a party," he'd said. "Big old house out in the countryside, tons of space, great history." The drive to the estate took nearly 2 hours, and by the time they arrived, it was almost 9 p.m. The house was enormous, a sprawling, Gothic-style mansion surrounded by bare trees and blanketed in fresh snow. The party was already in full swing, with music spilling out from the windows and laughter echoing through the chilly air. Claire's first impression of the house was that it was beautiful, but unnervingly quiet beneath the noise of the party. The kind of quiet that felt heavy, as though it had soaked into the walls over the years. Inside, the house was just as grand as she'd imagined. Chandeliers, winding staircases, and rooms filled with antique furniture. Mark greeted them warmly, handing them glasses of champagne and introducing them to his other guests. As the night wore on, Claire noticed something peculiar. No matter where she went in the house, she always felt like she was being watched. It wasn't the kind of thing she could put into words, just a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, an instinct she couldn't shake. Ian laughed when she brought it up. "It's probably just the atmosphere. Big old houses like this always have that creepy vibe, you know?" But Claire wasn't so sure. At some point past 11, Mark suggested they all take a tour of the house, a small group of them. Claire, Ian, and a handful of others followed him as he led them through the maze of hallways and rooms. "Fun fact," Mark said, stopping in front of a large wooden door. "This house has been in my family for over 100 years. My great-grandfather built it, and it's been passed down ever since." "What's behind the door?" someone asked. Mark hesitated. "This is the library. It's been locked for decades. Supposedly my great-grandfather's sister died in there. No one really knows what happened, but after that, they sealed it up. My family's always been superstitious about it." The group exchanged nervous glances, but someone joked, "Sounds like a ghost story to me." Mark laughed. "It probably is. Anyway, let's keep moving." They didn't stay on the tour much longer, but Claire couldn't stop thinking about the library. Something about the way Mark had talked about it felt off. By the time the countdown to midnight began, Claire was on edge. They'd gathered in the main sitting room, a large space with a roaring fire and a massive grandfather clock. Everyone shouted the numbers together, laughing and cheering. 10, 9, 8. The room was filled with energy, the excitement palpable. 7, 6, 5. Claire glanced at Ian, who was smiling and clinking glasses with someone. She forced a smile, trying to shake the tension in her chest. 4, 3, 2. Just as the clock struck midnight, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, and there was a collective gasp. "Don't worry," Mark called out. "Probably just the old wiring. I'll check the fuse box." But before anyone could move, a low, creaking sound filled the room. It was subtle at first, but it grew louder, echoing through the house. "What the hell is that?" Ian whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise. The creaking stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then a door slammed somewhere in the distance. The laughter and chatter from earlier were gone now, replaced by nervous whispers and shuffling feet. Someone turned on their phone's flashlight. the beam cutting through the darkness. Mark returned a minute later, his face pale. The fuse box isn't tripped. I don't know why the power's out. Claire felt her heart hammering in her chest. The air in the room had changed. It was heavier, colder. Let's just light some candles, Mark suggested, trying to keep his voice light. As they fumbled with lighters and candles, Claire noticed something odd. The fire in the hearth, which had been burning brightly, was now almost out, the embers faint and dim. And then she saw it. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the shadows. But as she stared, she realized there was a figure standing at the far end of the room. It was barely visible, a silhouette against the darkened walls. "Do you see that?" she whispered to Ian, grabbing his arm. "See what?" he asked, following her gaze. The figure moved. It didn't walk. It simply shifted, as though gliding across the floor. Claire gasped, and Ian's grip on her tightened. "What the?" "Did anyone else see that?" Claire blurted out, her voice louder than she intended. A few heads turned, but before anyone could answer, the figure was gone. "Claire, it's just your imagination," Ian said, though his voice wavered. But Claire knew what she'd seen. The rest of the party tried to carry on, but the atmosphere had shifted. People were tense, and some started to leave early, making excuses about the late hour. Claire and Ian decided to stay, mostly because Ian had had too much to drink, and Claire didn't want to risk the drive home. Mark offered them a guest room upstairs, and they reluctantly agreed. The room was small but cozy, with an antique four-poster bed and a single window overlooking the snowy grounds. Ian passed out almost immediately, but Claire couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the old house setting her nerves on edge. At some point she heard it again, the low, creaking sound from earlier. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, coming from somewhere down the hall. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Ian?" she whispered, shaking him, but he didn't stir. The creaking stopped, replaced by the soft sound of footsteps. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside their door. She held her breath, waiting, listening, and then the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, almost hesitantly, the door creaked open. Claire stared, frozen in place, as the dark hallway beyond seemed to stretch endlessly. And there, just beyond the threshold, was the figure. It was clearer now, a woman, her features pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stared. Claire wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The woman raised a hand, pointing down the hallway, and then, without a word, she disappeared. When Claire finally found her voice, she shook Ian awake. "We have to go," she said, her voice trembling. Ian groggily followed her out of the room, but as they made their way downstairs, Claire glanced back and saw her again. The woman was standing at the top of the staircase, watching them. They didn't stop running until they were in their car, the engine roaring to life as they sped away from the house. Claire never told Mark what she saw. She didn't need to. Some places, she realized, carry their history with them, and some histories refuse to stay buried.
Story number 8.
The invitation to the New Year's Eve party had come from an old college friend, Jake, who Claire hadn't seen in years. He was renting a historic manor in upstate New York, a place with a reputation for its grand architecture and, according to some, a dark history. Claire and her boyfriend Tom thought it sounded like the perfect way to ring in the new year, a cozy getaway with close friends, good food, and plenty of champagne. They arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the manor in an eerie orange glow. The house was massive, its brick facade flanked by towering windows that gleamed like empty eyes in the fading light. Jake greeted them at the door, his usual boisterous self ushering them into the warmth of the house. The party was small, just a dozen people gathered in the manor's cavernous sitting room. A fire roared in the massive stone hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Everyone was laughing, drinking, and catching up, the atmosphere lively and welcoming. But something about the house felt off to Claire. It wasn't just the size of the place or the creaking floorboards. It was the sense that something unseen was watching. She brushed it off as paranoia. Old houses made noise, and her imagination had always been too vivid for its own good. "Isn't this place amazing?" Jake asked as he handed Claire a glass of champagne. "It's been here since the late 1800s. They say the original owner went bankrupt and abandoned it, but there are other stories." What kind of stories? Claire asked, raising an eyebrow. Jake grinned. Ghost stories, of course. They say the house was cursed, something about the land it was built on. Supposedly there's a spirit that lingers here, especially on New Year's Eve. But hey, it's just a story, right? Claire laughed nervously and changed the subject, but the thought stuck with her. As the evening went on, the mood grew more festive. The group played games, danced to music, and shared resolutions for the year ahead. By the time the clock struck 11:30, most of the guests were thoroughly tipsy. That's when Jake suggested a tour of the house. Come on, he said, standing up and waving for everyone to follow. You can't stay in a place like this and not explore it. The group eagerly agreed, and they followed Jake as he led them up the grand staircase and through the winding corridors of the manor. He pointed out old portraits, antique furniture, and peculiar details like a hidden door in the library that led to a narrow staircase. Okay, this is the best part, Jake said as they reached the third floor. He stopped in front of a heavy wooden door with ornate carvings. This is the ballroom. The group gasped as Jake pushed the door open, revealing a massive, empty room. The wooden floor gleamed in the moonlight streaming through the tall windows, and the ceiling was adorned with a crumbling but intricate mural of dancers twirling in a grand celebration. Wow, someone whispered. It's beautiful, isn't it? Jake said. But here's the thing. This room hasn't been used in decades. They say it's haunted. People hear music coming from here late at night, even though it's empty. And some have even claimed to see figures dancing. Stop trying to scare us, Jake, one of the guests said with a laugh. But Claire didn't laugh. She felt it again, that sense of being watched. Her eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there, just the empty windows and the pale glow of the moon. The group left the ballroom after a few minutes, moving on to explore the rest of the house. But as they made their way back downstairs, Claire thought she heard something faint, a soft, lilting melody, like the distant strains of a piano. She stopped in her tracks, straining to listen, but the sound vanished. Everything okay? Tom asked, touching her arm. Yeah, Claire said quickly, forcing a smile. Just thought I heard something. By the time the group returned to the sitting room, it was almost midnight. Everyone gathered around the fireplace, glasses in hand, as Jake counted down the seconds. 10, 9, 8. Claire glanced around the room, her heart beating faster for reasons she couldn't explain. 7, 6, 5. The fire in the hearth suddenly flickered, as though a gust of wind had passed through the room. 4, 3, 2. The clock struck midnight, and the sound of a distant piano filled the air. The laughter and cheers stopped abruptly. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, the music growing louder and more distinct. It was a waltz, melancholic and haunting, the kind of melody that lingered in your bones. Is someone playing music? Jake asked, his voice unsteady. No one's at the piano, someone else whispered. And then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of footsteps above them. The group froze, their eyes darting to the ceiling. The footsteps were light, rhythmic, as though someone was dancing. They moved across the room above them, pausing for a moment before starting again. That's the ballroom, Claire said, her voice barely audible. Jake's face paled. No one's up there, we're the only ones here. But the sounds continued. The piano played on, and the footsteps echoed through the house. Someone whispered, "This isn't funny, Jake. Stop it." "I'm not doing anything," Jake said, his voice trembling. Then came a new sound, a low, guttural moan that seemed to reverberate through the walls. It was deep and mournful, sending chills down Claire's spine. The group huddled together, fear spreading like wildfire. Suddenly, the door to the sitting room slammed shut, the force of it rattling the windows. The fire in the hearth went out, plunging the room into darkness. Someone screamed, and Claire felt Tom's hand grab hers, pulling her close. "What's happening?" she whispered. Panic rising in her chest. Panic rising in her chest. "I don't know," Tom said. "We need to get out of here." The group scrambled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Claire could see her breath fogging in the icy air. And then she saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room, barely illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the windows. It was a woman in a tattered gown, her face pale and hollow. She tilted her head as she stared at the group, her eyes dark and empty. "Leave," the woman said, her voice a whisper that carried through the room like a gust of wind. The group didn't need to be told twice. The door suddenly flew open, and they bolted out into the snowy night, not stopping until they reached their cars. As Claire and Tom drove away, the house loomed in the rearview mirror, its dark windows staring back at them. They didn't speak of what happened that night. Some things, Claire realized, were better left behind. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The invitation to the New Year's Eve party was last minute, but Claire didn't mind. Her best friend Mia had called her that morning, bubbling with excitement about a gathering at an old farmhouse just outside town. Claire had heard of the place before, an isolated, weathered house perched on a hill. Some said it had been abandoned for years until someone had bought it recently and decided to restore its charm. "I heard the house is haunted," Mia teased on the phone. "But what's New Year's Eve without a little thrill?" Claire laughed it off. She didn't believe in ghosts. By the time she and Mia arrived that night, the party was in full swing. A string of fairy lights illuminated the long gravel driveway, and music thumped faintly through the frosty air. The house, however, seemed darker than she had imagined. Its sagging roof and crooked windows looked ominous against the pale moonlight. Inside, the energy was infectious. People were laughing, dancing, and sipping champagne from mismatched glasses. The farmhouse had been transformed with candles, glittering decorations, and a crackling fire in the large stone hearth. For a while, Claire forgot about the unsettling exterior of the place. Around 10 p.m., someone suggested a drinking game, and the group gathered around the long dining table. Mia nudged Claire. "You're too quiet. Get into it." Claire smiled and joined in, letting herself relax. But as the minutes ticked by, she began to feel off. The warmth of the room didn't reach her, and a strange heaviness settled over her chest. Every so often, she thought she saw shadows shifting in the dim corners, though when she turned, there was nothing there. "Claire?" Mia's voice broke through her thoughts. "You okay?" "Yeah," Claire said quickly. "Just tired, I guess." Mia shrugged and returned to the game, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the house felt oppressive, like it was alive with something unseen. At 11:30, the partygoers decided to explore the house. It started innocently enough, a group of half-drunk 20-somethings stumbling through the creaking hallways, laughing at every creak and groan of the old wood. The host, a cheerful guy named Tyler, led the way, flashlight in hand. "This house has some history," he said, as they climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. "Supposedly, the original owners disappeared one night. No one knows why." "Great bedtime story," someone joked, but their laughter sounded forced. The second floor was colder than downstairs. The group wandered through musty bedrooms and a bathroom with a cracked mirror. At the end of the hall was a door with peeling white paint. "What's in there?" Mia asked. Tyler hesitated. "That's the attic. I don't think we should go up there." "Why not?" Claire asked. "Just bad vibes," he said, half joking but clearly uneasy. The group laughed nervously, but no one pushed further. They made their way back downstairs, the mood quieter now. By the time they returned to the living room, the clock was inching toward midnight. "Let's get the countdown started," Tyler called, trying to lift the energy. The group gathered around the fireplace, glasses in hand. Claire stood beside Mia, staring at the flames as they danced in the hearth. She felt a chill at her back, as if a draft had swept through the room. She turned, but the door was closed. 10, 9, 8. The group's voices grew louder, cheering as the final seconds of the year ticked away. 7, 6, 5. Claire glanced around, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't explain. 4, 3, 2. The lights flickered. For a split second, the room plunged into darkness before the bulbs glowed weakly again. 1. Happy New Year. The cheer died quickly. As the lights stabilized, the air in the room seemed to shift. The fire in the hearth suddenly dimmed, the flames barely clinging to life. "What the hell was that?" someone muttered. Before anyone could respond, a loud thud echoed through the house, coming from the direction of the stairs. It was a deliberate, heavy sound, like something or someone had fallen. The group froze. "Tyler," Claire whispered, "did someone else come to the party?" "No," he said, his face pale. "We locked the door after everyone arrived." Another thud followed, then a dragging sound. It was coming from upstairs. "Maybe it's an animal," Maya suggested, though her voice wavered. An animal doesn't drag itself around, Claire said quietly. The dragging stopped, replaced by soft, rhythmic footsteps descending the staircase. The group stared at the open doorway, holding their breath as the sound grew closer. Is this a joke? One of the guests asked, looking at Tyler. Because it's not funny. Tyler shook his head, his hands trembling. I swear it's not me. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. The room was silent, except for the faint crackling of the fire. Slowly, Claire stepped toward the doorway, her curiosity overriding her fear. Claire, don't, Mia whispered. But Claire couldn't help herself. She peered into the hallway, her heart pounding. It was empty. Just as she turned back to the group, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Everyone screamed, and the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Claire felt Mia grab her arm. What's happening? I don't know, Claire said, her voice shaking. We need to get out of here. But as the group stumbled toward the door, the dragging sound returned, this time much louder. It came from behind them, moving closer with each passing second. Someone fumbled with their phone, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The light landed on a figure standing in the doorway to the kitchen. It was a man, or what had once been a man. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and lifeless. His clothes were tattered and stained with something dark. He stood perfectly still, staring at the group. Go! Tyler shouted, shoving the others toward the door. The group scrambled for the exit, but the front door wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut. The figure in the kitchen stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Claire turned back toward the fireplace, and her breath caught in her throat. There, in the flickering light, was another figure, a woman in a torn dress, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her empty eyes seemed to bore into Claire's soul. Please, Claire whispered, though she didn't know who or what she was pleading with. The woman raised a hand, pointing toward the staircase. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the lights flickered back on. The figures were gone. The door swung open and the cold night air rushed in. No one said a word as they bolted out of the house, leaving behind their coats, their bags, everything. Claire didn't look back as she and Mia climbed into the car and sped away, the farmhouse shrinking in the rearview mirror. They never spoke of that night again. But Claire couldn't shake the memory of the woman's eyes, or the way the air had felt thick and heavy with something ancient, something angry. Some houses, she realized, weren't meant to be lived in. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The invitation came from a mutual friend, Emma, who had rented a secluded cabin for a New Year's Eve party. It sounded perfect. Just a few close friends, good food, and a roaring fire to keep the winter chill at bay. Claire and her boyfriend Alex arrived just before dusk, the sun dipping behind the snow-covered trees as the cabin came into view. It was picturesque, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was too isolated. The surrounding woods seemed to press in on them, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. She brushed the thought aside as they parked and carried their bags inside. The cabin was charming, with rustic decor, a large stone fireplace, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the forest. The other guests, Emma, her boyfriend Mark, and two others, Jess and Tyler, were already there, sipping wine and laughing as they set up decorations. Finally! Emma exclaimed, pulling Claire into a hug. We thought you two got lost. Almost, Alex joked. This place is seriously out in the middle of nowhere. That's the point, Emma said with a grin. No distractions, just us, ringing in the new year. As the evening wore on, the group settled into a comfortable rhythm. They cooked dinner together, shared stories by the fire, and played games as the hours ticked by. But as midnight approached, Claire couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at her since they'd arrived. It started with the sound of footsteps outside. At first, Claire thought she'd imagined it. The others were laughing and talking loudly, the crackling fire masking most of the noise. But when she got up to refill her drink and passed by the window, she froze. Something moved in the darkness. A shadow just at the edge of the tree line. Everything okay? Alex asked, coming up behind her. Yeah, Claire said quickly. Just thought I saw something. Alex glanced out the window but shrugged. Probably just a deer. You know how it is out here. Claire nodded, forcing herself to relax. But as the clock crept closer to midnight, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. She found herself glancing over her shoulder, her eyes drawn to the windows. At 11:45, the power went out. The group groaned in unison, the cozy glow of the cabin replaced by complete darkness. Someone fumbled for their phone, and a beam of light illuminated Emma's annoyed expression. "Great timing," she muttered. "Mark, check the fuse box." Mark sighed but grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the back of the cabin. Claire watched him go, the knot in her stomach tightening. "Let's light some candles," Jess suggested, already rummaging through a drawer. Within minutes, the room was bathed in the warm, flickering glow of candlelight. The group tried to laugh it off, but the energy in the room had shifted. "Did anyone else hear that?" Tyler asked suddenly, his voice low. "Hear what?" Emma asked, annoyed. "That," Tyler said, pointing toward the window. They all fell silent, and Claire strained to listen. At first there was nothing, just the wind whistling through the trees. But then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from outside. "Probably a branch," Alex said, trying to sound calm. But his hand tightened around Claire's. "No way," Tyler said, shaking his head. "That's not a branch." The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It moved, as if circling the cabin. The group exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado fading fast. "Mark's been gone too long," Emma said, standing abruptly. "I'm going to check on him." "I'll come with you," Jess offered, and the two disappeared into the back hallway. The rest of the group huddled near the fireplace, their unease palpable. The tapping stopped suddenly, replaced by the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. They were slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to be an animal. "Who's out there?" Tyler called, his voice cracking. He grabbed a poker from the fireplace and moved toward the door. Claire wanted to stop him, but her voice caught in her throat. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, without warning, the door rattled violently as if someone or something was trying to force it open. The group screamed, backing away as the door shook on its hinges. "Mark? Jess?" Emma's voice called from the hallway. They turned to see her and Jess standing there, pale and wide-eyed. "It's not Mark," Jess whispered. "We found him. He's out cold in the storage room. Something hit him." "What do you mean, something?" Alex demanded. Jess shook her head, trembling. "I don't know. He's bleeding, but he's breathing." The door rattled again, harder this time. The candles flickered violently, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Claire felt a chill run down her spine as she glanced toward the window. Her heart stopped. A face stared back at her. It was pale and expressionless, its eyes black voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. It tilted its head as if curious, and then vanished. "We need to leave," Claire said, her voice barely audible. "Are you crazy?" Emma snapped. "We can't go out there. We can't stay here either," Tyler shouted. "Whatever this is, it's not going to stop." The group argued, their fears spiraling into chaos. But before they could make a decision, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room in harsh, artificial brightness. The door stopped rattling, the candles burned steadily again, the footsteps were gone. Did it leave?" Jess whispered. "I don't know," Alex said, "but I'm not sticking around to find out." They gathered Mark, who was groggy but conscious, and piled into their cars. No one looked back as they sped down the icy road, the cabin shrinking in the rearview mirror. Weeks later, Claire tried to make sense of what had happened that night. She searched online for stories about the cabin and found a chilling detail. Years ago, a man had gone missing in those woods on New Year's Eve. His body was never found, but locals swore his restless spirit wandered the area, searching for warmth, for company, for revenge. Claire closed her laptop, her hands shaking. She didn't know if she believed it, but one thing was certain: she would never return to that cabin again. Story, the end.